Hello viewers. Today we will be studying the topic Capitalism as a Historical Process, the Materialistic Conception of History. Students, Karl Marx's writings can be analyzed and explained in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 years, or even half a century. This was said by the very popular French political theorist Raymond Aron. So true he was. Marx exerted a decisive influence on major areas of politics, society, economy, history, anthropology, cultural studies, to name a few. Karl Marx was the last of the critique in the Western political tradition. His ideas shaped the course of the study of history, society, and economy. By developing a theory of practice, Karl Marx established unity of thought and action, brought about a revolutionary transformation in which we interpret society, polity, and economy. Students, historical materialism is the basis of Marxian understanding of political thought. Marx inherited and integrated 3 major intellectual traditions. They were the German political thought, French political philosophy, and the English economics. But he did not apply them directly. He made transformation into these ideas and applied it in that contemporary society. Students, before we try to understand Marxian theory, it's imperative to understand certain concepts which Marx used. Let us try to understand what are these concepts. The ensuing discussion will focus on Marxian concept of dialectics, history and society, certain concepts like forces of production, relations of production, mode of production, Marxian concept of base and superstructure. An analysis of these concepts will help us to understand how Marx theorized history and how he explained the course of historical process. Let us start off with Marxian concept of dialectics. Now, dialectics was the basic and the central point of Hegelian philosophy. However, Marx did not directly apply Hegelian dialectics. In Hegelian philosophy, dialectics applied to the process, evolution, and development of history. Hegel viewed history as the progressive manifestation of human reason and the development of a historical spirit. History recorded an increasing awareness and a greater rationality as exhibited in human affairs. Marx brought about a certain change in it. Central to Marx's thought was the theory of historical materialism, which argued that societies and the cultural institutions are shaped by the economic activities. Marx's theory was heavily influenced by, as I just said, Hegelian dialectics. But while Marx agreed with Hegelian dialectic thesis of social change, he disagreed with the notion that abstract ideas were the engine of growth. Rather, Marx argued that it was material, economic forces that shaped nature and the physical world. In fact, this is what drove the dialectics of change. More specifically, according to Marx, the engine of history is shaped by the internal contradictions within the different systems of material production. Now, how do we situate capitalism within the historical process? According to Marx, all historical changes are determined by the mode of production, which constitute in them the economic forces. Any change in the mode or technique of production will bring about a simultaneous change in the pattern of relations between men and others. which Marx called the relations of production. Now let us go a little deeper into this. How did Marx visualize history, and what are the key factors that shaped the determination of historical forces? Now, in order to understand Marxian analysis of history and capitalism, it is essential to understand what these forces of production and relations of production constitute. Now, students, forces of production constitute 1. The means of production, and 2. Labor power. In other words, forces of production constitute the technology used in the production process as well as the laborers who work in that technological process. Secondly, when people or workers engage themselves in the production processes, they enter into certain kind of relations. These relations that men enter while being in the producing process or the production process is called the relations of production. Now, whenever there is a change in the forces of production, the techniques of production, there will be a change in the relations of production. Now, these forces of production and relations of production constitute the mode of production, which in simple terms mean that a change in the forces of production will bring about a change in the relations of production, and together they'll bring about a change in the mode of production. Now let us try to understand two very significant concepts in historical materialism. They are base and superstructure. According to Marx, base comprise the mode of production of a particular system. In fact, the base was the economic foundation of the society. The mode of production, in other words, comprised the base, and the mode of production comprised the forces and the relations men entered with one another. Now, based on this mode of production, the superstructure was created. So, superstructure was based on the type of economic base that provided or that was present in a particular society. Now, the superstructure comprised of the legal institutions, the political institutions, the social institutions, and a change in the base led to a change in the superstructure. So, please note that whenever there was a change in the base, there would automatically lead to a change in the superstructure. So, during the capitalist system, when the base was controlled by the capitalist and the relations were between the capitalist and the wage laborers, the state or the superstructure was also controlled by the capitalist. So, here we find a close relationship between the base and the superstructure, and history recorded a change in the relationship between base and superstructure with the progression of the historical forces. Now, we need to understand another important concept, that forces of production, relations of production, mode of production change with the progress of history. Karl Marx has identified 5 major stages of history. According to him, these 5 major stages were the stage of primitive communism, which was the first stage. Second stage was the age of slavery. Third was the feudal age. Fourth, the capitalist age. And the last was the socialist or the communist stage. Let us now move on to an elaborate understanding of each of these phases to understand how the forces and relations of production operated within each of these phases of history. Now, when you are able to understand these 5 phases, you will get a clear understanding of how history is a progressive succession of different stages of economic development. Let us start with the first one, the age of primitive communism. Now, students, this was the very first and the stage of inception. People lived a nomadic life. They moved from one place to another place. There was no private property system. Whatever they collected, they consumed. There was no surplus. And there was a communal way of living. People lived in communities and there was no concept of mine and thine. in this phase, students, we did not find any antagonistic relationship between the people who owned or the people who worked. In fact, there was a community ownership of the means of production. Since the community owned the means of production, there was no concept of exploitation in the first phase. So in the first phase, we find that here the system operated in a very primitive or a savage state, and we do not find any form of exploitation. Let's move on to the next phase of history, which is the age of slavery. Here we find two classes clearly emerging. One was the slave owners and the other was the slaves. Now here we find a steady development in the means of production. Here we find that the slave owners, they controlled the means of production. They had access to land, property. They had access to the slave also, whom they could sell and buy at any given point of time. In other words, the slave did not have any voluntary will to choose the slave owner. Now, here what we find, certain developments in the means of production. Instead of the stone tools, the bow and the arrow used in the primitive communist stage, we here find the use of the metal as a means of production. We also find here the pastoral stage has given way to the stage of agricultural production in the formative stages. Now, we also find another important thing in the slave system is that some form of exchange of commodities started between individuals who owned those commodities and between individuals who did not possess them. However, actual accumulation of means of production in the hands of the minority and then the subjugation of the majority by the minority just started off, and here we find the slaves being the exploited lot and the slave owners the exploiting class. So there was an antagonistic relationship between the two. Coming to the next phase of development of history, which is called the age of feudalism or feudal society. The basis of the relationship in this stage was the means of production were a little developed. Here we find the feudal lord having control over the means of production and the serfs who were the subservient or the subordinate class, and they worked under the feudal lords. Now here we find a little change in the process from what we found in the slave society. Here the feudal lords possessed access to land, landed property, and they also had access to the productive processes in the society. Now here we find another class of people coming up. They are the peasantry or the farming community. They had access to implements of production process, but they did not have access to land. Land was controlled by the lords. These landless peasantry, the serfs, they used to work in the land of the landed lord. But here we find that this serfs had a kind of voluntary will to work or not to will, and they can switch off their own the ownership to work under one lord and another lord. But here we also need to observe that there has been considerable improvements in the working of the means and forces of production. Here we found the iron plough being introduced, we have the loom being introduced, we have the textile mills coming up, and different processes of handicrafts and artisans coming up in a formal way. Now let us move on to the other features of the feudal system. The feudal lord had access to the slave and he could utilize the serf in ways he wishes. But then he could not sell off the slave like it was done in the previous stage. Exploitation. Exploitation was very severe in this stage and it was more pronounced than the previous stage. The serfs were subordinated and there was massive exploitation at the hands of the feudal lords. Let us move on to the capitalist society, which started off with the coming of the industrial age. Now, in the capitalist society, the ownership of the means of production, the factories, land, etc., was in the hands of the capitalists, who were also called the haves or the propertied class. They controlled the wage laborers, or what Marx uses the word proletariats. Now these wage laborers had freedom to work in the factories that they chose to. But here, the capitalists, though they controlled the means of production, they had no right to kill or sell the wage laborers. The wage laborers, on the other hand, had the right to work in the factories that they wanted. But you need to understand that labor power came up in a very, very big way and a formal and organized way under the capitalist system. Alongside capitalist ownership of the means of production, we also find private ownership of the production processes. What we mean by that in this stage you no longer have serfs or slaves. Here you have wage laborers who are ready to sell off their labor power in exchange of money, in exchange of certain forms of capital. Now, here we also find another very important and an interesting object. The new productive forces require that the workers in the production process shall be better educated, more intelligent than the serfs and the slaves, which is a very unique feature of the capitalist system, because you need to know, students, that with capitalism came in division of labor and specialization of workforce. Therefore, the capitalists preferred to deal with wage workers, wage laborers, who are free from the bondage of serfdom, slavery, and who are educated enough to contribute properly to the production process. Now, let us go a little deeper into the capitalist system. Now, capitalism entails large-scale production process. Capitalism entails the production of surplus, capitalism entails private profit, competition, and here we also find that small factory owners, small owners of means of production could not compete with the big, massive, large-scale production system, and ultimately they were also converted into this wage laborer or working class. Because here you have to understand that this was a system where large-scale production processes profited and small owners could not compete with these mega giants in the production process. Another important point to note is that with expanding production and millions of workers working in huge mills and factories, we also find production taking a social character, where we find these proletariats or the working class, they enter into different kinds of relationship with one another. However, we should not lose sight of the fact that despite the workers were organized, despite the workers were working in large numbers, the means of production was still owned by the capitalists, and the capitalist system, they contributed and they constituted the economic base. Marx now says that capitalism will end with workers becoming organized and there would be a revolution. This would give way to a society which would be the socialist society. The basis of relations of production under the socialist system would be social ownership of the means of production. Here, you do not have the concept of exploiters or exploited. The goods produced and distributed according to labor performed on the principle, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. Here, the mutual relations of people in the process of production are marked by cooperation, mutual interdependence, mutual assistance, and all of them are free from exploitation. Communism, Marx and Engels distinguish between two forms of communism, the lower form of communism and the higher form of communism, and there was a subtle difference between the two forms. In the lower form of communism, people are still paid according to their abilities and ownership of the means of production controlled by the state. However, students, in the higher form of production, the state will wither away and distribution will take place according to the principle of from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. So here what we find, the state will wither away and there would be a system of cooperative ownership of means of production and the productive processes. Everybody will work according to their abilities and get according to their needs. At this juncture, it is imperative to understand the relationship between society and economy. If you have noticed, students, that Marx was very conscious about the relationship between people in a particular societal system, and that was shaped by the economic processes. In other words, whenever there was a change in the economic system, there was a consequent change in the societal system also. However, one thing is clear. Except the stage of primitive communism and the communist and the socialist stage, we find there were two antagonistic classes, the exploiters and the exploited. If you look into the age of slavery, we find two antagonistic classes. They were the slave owners and the slaves. In the age of feudalism, we find two antagonistic classes, the feudal lords and the serfs. In the capitalist age, we find the two antagonistic classes. They were the property owners as well as the wage laborers or proletariats. Here we need to understand that Marx provided with a historical statement. I quote him, "The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle," which means that caste struggle is an inevitable part of the historical process. To understand the relationship between society and economy, I quote Marx and Engels, where they have beautifully showed the transformation in the societal and economic system. To quote Marx and Engels, "Social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production. And in changing their mode of production, in changing the way of earning their living, they change all their social relations. The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord. The steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist." Unquote. Now, in each of these stages of history, there are certain common elements. Let us find out the similarities in these stages of history. Each of these stages have a mode of production which was peculiar to that stage. Each stage followed logically from the previous stage. This is because each of the stages had certain inherent and internal contradictions which gave way to tensions, and out of these tensions arose the next stage. Which means that the contradictions will not be lifelong. The contradictions will eventually break down and a new system will emerge from the previous one. Now, how do we evaluate Marx's theory of historical materialism? Does the Marxian theory of historical materialism propose that all countries have to go through each of these stages? Can we skip these stages? Or a time can come when we can slide back to the previous stage? So what does he say about it? Marx himself spoke about various stages can coexist with one another. But at one point of time, there will be a dominant stage and a dominant mode of production. So even if you are sliding back, skipping or coexisting with a particular means of production, system of production, mode of production, there would be one dominant mode of production which would be the central focus at that particular point of time. A detailed study of Marxian and post-Marxian thinkers and the different historical experiences of societies indicate that the different stages of history cannot be considered in a definite, predetermined fashion. Furthermore, criticism against Marxian theory of historical materialism highlights the fact that yes, It is important to understand the economic conditions prevalent in society, but then economic conditions cannot be the sole factor in the description and analysis of a particular type of society. We also need to understand the socio-political forces prevalent at one point of time. So critiques of Marxian theory of historical materialism opine that historical factors, economic factors are important, but you also have to give focus to the socio-political conditions prevalent at that point of time. They are of the view that Marx quite correctly diagnosed the disease of the capitalist system, but he failed to foresee the emergence of countervailing political forces. Thus, students, according to the critiques, even admitting the paramount significance of the economic factors in history, the Marxian attempt to give one factor the pivotal role in the causation of historical changes is hostile to a rational understanding of history. Thus, what we found in this discussion on capitalism as a historical process is that Marx was highly influenced by Hegelian dialectics, but he added certain new changes, ideas into it. He tried to analyze capitalism as a historical process through certain core concepts, and they were forces of production, means of production, and the mode of production. He also tried to understand and analyze society through the basic conceptualization of base and superstructure, where base comprised the economic structure of the society and superstructure referred to the political, economic, and other systems and institutions. So he was of the opinion that with a change in the base, there came about a change in the superstructure also. After that, Marx focused on the 5 stages of history. He referred to the primitive communism, age of slavery, feudal age, capitalist, socialist, and the communist stage. These were the 5 stages, but he was quick to say that except the first stage, we have antagonistic relations in all the other stages, that is in the feudal stage, in the age of slavery, and the capitalist stage. He was also aware of the fact that exploitation was acute in the capitalist stage, which resulted in a revolution by the proletariats who were organized, and ultimately came about a socialist and a communist stage where the state had withered away and people worked according to their abilities and received according to their needs. However, Marx provided the objective and analysis of historical materialism by saying that history reflects a struggle among different societies, and these struggles arose because of the conflicting relations between the mode of production, relations of production, and the forces of production. Thus, changes in any of these production processes which bring about a change in the historical process itself. Thank you.